Text of Zhang Ailing's Half-Life Chapter 12. When Yujin got married, she borrowed a place in a club. There were a lot of people coming that day, almost all of them relatives and friends of the woman. Yujin had relatively few acquaintances in Shanghai. Mrs. Gu went to congratulate her. She had agreed with Manzin to meet there, so she kept looking at the crowd, but she didn't see her coming until the wedding was over. Mrs. Gu thought, "This child is really strange. Even if she doesn't want to come, I told her yesterday that she should arrive today no matter what. How could she not come, unless her sister's illness has caused another problem? She suddenly feels bad and she really can't go away." Mrs. Gu immediately became restless, thinking that Manlu might have entered a dying state. At this time, the bride and groom had already exited the auditorium amidst the sound of music, and the guests were seated and having refreshments. At a glance, they were all smiling faces and noisy laughter. Mrs. Gu felt even more confused when she was in the middle of it. "Originally, I wanted to wait for the bride and groom to come back and talk to them before leaving, but then I couldn't wait any longer and left first. As soon as I left the house, I called a rickshaw and went straight to Ju's house on Hongqiao Road." In fact, her imagination was far from reality. Manlu was actually in good health, not even looking sick at all. She was wearing a satin cotton dressing gown, sitting on the sofa, smoking a cigarette, and talking to Hong Kai. However, Hong Kai looked a bit like a patient. There were 2 pieces of adhesive plaster on his face, and his hands were bandaged. He was still a little shocked until now, and he said again and again, "I have never seen such a woman. She can bite." He was dragged off the bed by her, and he fell so hard that he almost couldn't hold him down. She ran away, only to feel a heat under the tip of her nose, and nosebleeds flowed down. He was so flustered by her yelling that he was bitten so hard that he finally grabbed her hair and banged her head on the floor several times before knocking her unconscious. At that time, he didn't know in the darkness that she was dead, and even her death would grant him his wish. Afterwards, he turned on the light and saw that she was still breathing. Before she woke up, she took off her clothes and took off her clothes. She looked like a naked corpse. This time, he had played with her so much that he wished he could die on her body. It was the first and last night. Manlu said calmly, "It's not her fault. Do you still think that people will treat you like a big spender? Or what?" Hong Kai said, "No, you haven't seen her like that. She's just like a crazy girl." "She's crazy. If I had known she had this temper." Manlu cut him off before he could finish his words and said, "Because I knew her temper, I always said I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. You thought I was jealous and treated me like an enemy because of this. At this time, I was really cornered by you and finally came up with such an idea for you. At this time, you became afraid again. You are so aren't you trying to make me angry?" She pointed a cigarette directly at his face, almost burning him. Hong Kai frowned and said, "Don't blame me all the time. You can tell me what to do." Manlu said, "What do you want to do?" Hong Kai said, "It's okay to keep her locked in the room. Sooner or later Mom is coming to ask us for someone." Manlu said, "That's not because I'm afraid of her. My mother is the easiest to deal with, unless her fiancé comes out to speak." Hong Kai stood up in excitement, paced back and forth, and murmured. She said authentically, "This matter is really big." Seeing his cowardly look, Manlu felt really angry, so she sneered, "What's the point? Let her go quickly. I'm willing to eat someone like you for nothing. Losing. It's useless no matter how much money you spend. I'm not in business, so I can't spend it that easily." Hong Kai said, "That's why I'm anxious." Manlu snorted again and said with a smile, "Why are you anxious? It's her turn to be anxious. She's already having sex with you anyway. No matter how cruel she is, she can't do this. Give her 2 days to think about it carefully, and then I'll try to persuade her. If she understands by then, people have no choice but to get off the stairs when they see them." Hong Kai was still a little doubtful because he really lacked self-confidence in front of Manzin. He said, "What if I persuade her not to listen?" Manlu said, "The only way is to lock her up for a few more days to control her temper." Hong Kai said, "Can't we lock her up for the rest of her life?" Manlu smiled and said, "That can still be done." "Lock her up for the rest of her life? One day she will raise a child. Don't worry. She won't leave even if you drive her away. She will have to sue you for abandonment." After Hong Kai heard this, his worries turned into joy. He was stunned for a while, still seemed a little worried, and then said, "But, according to her temper, do you think she is really willing to be a child?" Man Lu said coldly, "She doesn't want me to let her, so how about that?" Hong Kai knew that she was talking angrily, so he laughed and said, "What are you talking about? I won't agree to it from now on. I will slowly repay you in the future. Where can I find a virtuous wife like you? I haven't been filial to you yet." Man Lu smiled and said, Okay, stop coaxing me. Just be less angry with me." Hong Kai smiled and said, "You're still angry with me." He held her hand with saliva and said, "Don't you feel bad when you see me beating others like this?" Man Lu pushed him hard and said, "You only deserve to be treated like this. Who would be a piece of cake? My heart is focused on you, and I'm sure it'll make you angry and sad. Do you think it's true? You can check your conscience for yourself." Hong Kai smiled and said, Yes, don't fight with me again. I can't stand you. Sisters and sons are rubbing each other together like this." As he said that, she couldn't help but look smug, and Man Lu felt that he was already embracing her. She wanted to raise her hand right away and slap him twice, but this was just her impulse. This time she had the purpose of using her sister to win his heart. It was like some old ladies in the past, because they were afraid that their sons would wander outside and be difficult to control. So they deliberately taught him to smoke opium to make him indulging in it is like holding a string on a kite in your hand. No longer afraid that it will fly far away and never come back. The couple were having a secret conversation in the room, and the Bao came in a little panicked and said, "Miss, the wife is here." Man Lu threw the cigarette away and said to Hong Kai, "Leave it to me. You can hide for a while." Hong Kai hurriedly stood up, and Man Lu said again, "You are still staying in the room yesterday. Listen to my message. Don't run out again." Hong Kai smiled and said, "Don't you even look at me like this. How can I get out? Tell my friends not to laugh at me if they see it." Man Lu said, "When did you care about face like this again? People don't think you are a husband and wife fighting. And you got a black nose and swollen eyes." Hong Kai smiled and said, "Then no, everyone knows that my wife is virtuous." Man Lu couldn't help but smile and said, Let's go. You think I just love to wear a high hat?" Hong Kai hurriedly opened a door, went into the back room, and took a detour from the back to go downstairs. Man Lu also hurriedly scattered her hair and rubbed it like a chicken coop, then picked up a cold towel, wiped her face randomly, wiped off the makeup on her face, took off her dressing gown, and got into the room. "Go and lie down under the covers. Mrs. Gu has already come in here." Although Man Lu pretended to be sick, Mrs. Gu was surprised when she saw her. She smiled and said, "Hey, you look much better today. You are almost the same person as yesterday." Man Lu sighed. Okay. What? I only got 2 injections of cardiotonic injections." Mrs. Gu didn't quite understand what she said. She just said cheerfully, "The speech is much louder. What she did yesterday really shocked me." She just said even though she was waiting for Manzin to come and scare herself. She still thought that Man Lu's condition was turning critical, so she immediately came to visit her. Of course, she ignored this episode. She sat down on the edge of the bed, held Man Lu's hand and said with a smile, "Where is your second sister?" Man Lu said, "Mom, you don't even know. Just for her, I was so anxious that I almost passed away. If it weren't for the doctor, I've been given 2 injections of cardiotonic injections, and I'm already dead by now." Mrs. Gu was stunned and just said, "What's wrong?" Man Lu seemed to be in pain, turned away and faced the bed, saying, "Mom, I don't even know what to say to you." Mrs. Gu said, "What's wrong with her? Where is she? She stood up and looked around anxiously. Man Lu pulled her tightly and said, "Mom, sit down. Wait until I tell you. I won't even mention how angry I am." Hong Kai hasn't been home for several days, but yesterday I came back in the evening, and I don't know why he was so drunk that he ran to the room where the second sister lived in a daze. I was too sick to know what was going on, So when I arrived, I knew I had caused trouble. Mrs. Gu was stunned for a long time and then said, "How can this be done? Your second sister already has a family. How could he do this? My aunt, this is screwing me to death." Man Lu said, "Mom, please stop first. Noisy, I feel even more confused when you make a fuss." Mrs. Gu was so anxious that her eyes were straight, and said, "Where is Hong Kai? I will fight him desperately." Man Lu said, "How can he have the face to see you?" He himself, I also knew that I was in trouble. So I said to him, "Aren't you going to harm this person for the rest of her life? How do you tell her to get married in the future? You have to pay me back." Mrs. Gu said, "Yes." What did he say? Man Lu said, "He promised to officially marry his second sister." After hearing this, Mrs. Gu was very unexpected and said, "Officially married? What about you?" Man Lu said, "He and I, it's not official." Mrs. Gu said resolutely, "That's not possible. It doesn't make sense." Man Lu sighed and said, "Hey, Mom, look at how long I can live. I still care about this." Mrs. Gu couldn't help feeling sad and said, "Stop talking nonsense." Man Lu said, "I won't die just yet. I'm so sick and crooked. How can I go out to socialize? I don't think anything will happen in the future. Let her come forward and let outsiders know that she is Mrs. Zhu Hong Kai. I only need to eat a bowl of free food at home. Fortunately, we are our sisters. Am I still afraid that she will treat me badly?" Mrs. Gu felt very miserable after what she said, because she said, "Even if you say this, it still doesn't work." "You are so wronged," Man Lu said. "Who told me to marry this man? He is so worthless. Besides, if it hadn't been for my illness, this incident wouldn't have happened. I'm really embarrassed to see my mother." At this point, she wiped away tears. Mrs. Gu also cried. Mrs. Gu felt sad at this time, and it was also because Manzan asked her to follow Shu Hong Kai. She must have been unwilling, but now she had to compromise. Although Mrs. Gu still felt that Man Lu's suggestion was not very appropriate, it was not yet a solution among the last. Mrs. Gu was stunned for a while. Then she stood up and said, "I'm going to see her." Man Lu sat up suddenly and said, "Don't go yet," and then lowered her voice. Secretly, he said quietly, "You don't know. It's making a big fuss, and you need to report it to the police station." Mrs. Gu said in surprise, "Hey, this kid is so ignorant. How can he shout about this kind of thing? He has no shame in it." Where? Man Lu whispered, "Yes, everyone is shameless. Hong Kai has a certain status in society now. It would be embarrassing if others knew about it." Mrs. Gu nodded and said, "I'll go and persuade him." Persuade her to go. Man Lu said, "Mom, I think you should not meet her at this time. You know her temper. She has heard what you said, and now she is angry again." Mrs. Gu, she couldn't help but hesitated and said, "Then we can't let her temper make trouble." Man Lu said, "Yeah, I was so anxious that I had no choice but to say that she was sick and had to rest, and no one was allowed to go to her room. Go in and don't let her come out." When Mrs. Gu heard this, she suddenly shuddered for some reason and felt something was wrong. Seeing that she was silent, Man Lu said, "Mom, don't be anxious. Wait for 2 more days until her anger subsides. Then we will slowly persuade her. As long as she agrees, we will do it right away." Hong Sai's side will have no problem with the happy event, but now the problem lies with her and the man named Shen. "You said they are engaged?" Mrs. Gu said, "Yes." "What should you say at this time?" "Back home," Man Lu said. "Is he in Shanghai now?" Mrs. Gu said, "He came to Shanghai yesterday morning." Man Lu said, "Does he know she came here?" Mrs. Gu said, "I don't know. He just came here yesterday morning, but he hasn't been here since." Man Lu pondered. "That's obviously strange. The two of them had a quarrel." Mrs. Gu said, "If you don't tell me, I won't either." Unexpectedly, I heard the old lady say yesterday that Manzan dropped her engagement ring into the wastebasket. "Didn't she throw it away on purpose?" Man Lu said, "There must have been a quarrel. I don't know why. No. Is it because of Eugen again?" Eugen and Manzan were very close to each other for a time, and this incident was the most heartbreaking for Man Lu, and she will never forget it. Mrs. Gu thought for a while and said, "It can't be for Yujin. Yujin came to our place yesterday. Shijin had already left at that time, and the two of them didn't meet at all." Man Lu said, "Oh, Yujin came yesterday. What's the reason for his coming?" She was suddenly filled with jealousy and forgot everything else. Mrs. Gu said, "He is here to send us a wedding invitation. You see, I didn't plan to tell you, but they told me to let it slip again. I am so anxious and confused now." Man Lu was stunned for a moment, said, "Oh, he's getting married." Mrs. Gu said, "Today." Man Lu smiled and said, "You said you were going to have a wedding banquet yesterday, but you were just going to have his wedding banquet? Why are you hiding this from me?" Mrs. Gu said, "It was your second sister who told me not to tell you yet because you are sick and can't stand the excitement." But when Man Lu heard these two sentences at this time, she was deeply stimulated, because she found that her sister was so considerate to her. From this point of view, in front of many people in the family, only the second sister was her confidant, and what she had done was so sorry, she suddenly felt very ashamed. In the past, she had wrongly blamed her second sister for what happened to Yujin. There was no need to hate her so much, but now it was too late to regret it. She could only defend herself. Now that the matter was over, it was hard to get off the horse. The evil people have no choice but to do it to the end. Man Lu just thought deeply, holding the phone cord in front of the bed and playing with it. The round phone cord was wrapped around her wrist like a small snake. Mrs. Gu suddenly said, "A good person can't just disappear like this. How will I tell them when I go back?" Man Lu said, "It doesn't matter to the old lady. You can tell her the truth. I'm afraid she won't be tight-lipped." "Look, let's do it. Fortunately, my brother and the others are still young and don't know much." Mrs. Gu frowned and said, "Do you think they are still children? Wyman is already 15 after the new year." Man Lu said. He asked, "Just tell him that the second sister is sick and is recuperating here. Just tell him that it is lung disease, and that he can't go out to do anything in the future. The family will have to live more frugally in the future. Living in Shanghai is too expensive and he has to move to the mainland." Mrs. Gu said blankly, "What are you doing?" Man Lu whispered, "Just stay away for now, lest that person named Zhen comes to find her." Mrs. Gu said nothing. She has lived in Shanghai for many years. And when she was asked to tear down this house all of a sudden, it seemed like the roots had been ripped out, and she was really reluctant to let it go. But Man Lu didn't allow her to be half-hearted, so she picked up the phone and called Hung Sai's office. They had a waiter named Xiao Tao, who was very alert and literate. He often ran errands for Man Lu. Although there were errands in the family, there was no one as useful as him, so she asked him to come immediately. After hanging up the phone, she said to Mrs. Gu, "I'm going to ask him to go find a house in Suzhou." Mrs. Gu said, "It's better to go back to the countryside than to move to Suzhou. The old lady is always thinking about going back." But Man Lu, she felt that there were too many acquaintances there, and Shijin also knew that it was their hometown, so it would be easy to track down their whereabouts. She then said, "It's better to be in Suzhou, which is closer. I won't be able to live there long anyway, so I can wait for a happy event here. Once the time comes, I have to bring my mother back to marry me. Of course, I will still live in Shanghai in the future, and it will be more convenient for the children to go to school. When the eldest brother graduates, don't rush to ask him to find a job. Let him study for 2 more years. Ask Hong Kai tomorrow to send him to study abroad. After all these years of hardship, Mom should enjoy the blessings. From now on, if you live with me, I won't allow you to wash clothes and cook anymore. Mom is so old. You shouldn't do such heavy things again. I was so tired yesterday that my waist was twisted. You don't even know how uncomfortable I feel when I hear this." Mrs. Gu felt confused after what she said, especially her the eldest brother's bright future is depicted. The mother and daughter talked about it. Xiao Tao had already arrived. In front of her mother, Man Lu asked him to leave that day and rent a house in Suzhou. He would move there within a few days and send a telegram at the last minute. Give it to him so that he can go to the station to greet you. She also asked Mrs. Gu to go back quickly to pack her things, asked a car to take her back, and asked Xiao Tao to take her car with her. Mrs. Gu originally wanted to ask for a meeting with Manzin, But she had nothing to say in front of Xiaotao, so she had no choice but to leave, carrying a sum of money given by Manlu. Mrs. Gu sat back in the car, feeling a little worried all the time, thinking about how she should answer when the old lady and the children asked Manzin about it later. At this time, they must have not come back from the wedding banquet. As soon as she rang the bell, the old woman from the Liu family came to open the door. As soon as she opened the door, she said, "Mr. Shen is here. You all have gone out. He has been waiting here for a long time." Mrs. Gu's heart skipped a beat, and she was almost nervous. She had completely forgotten everything Manlu had taught her, so she had no choice but to walk in and meet Zhen. It turned out that Zhen had a falling out with Manzin yesterday and had been walking around alone since leaving Gu's house. He returned to Shu Hui's house very late and didn't sleep all night. This afternoon he called Manzin's office. When he asked, Manzin didn't come today. He thought she might be sick, so he rushed to her house immediately. Unexpectedly, their whole family went out, and the Liu family, the old lady, told him that Manzin had gone to her sister's house yesterday. Her sister's house sent a car to pick her up, but she never came back. Zhen heard yesterday that her sister was sick. She must have gone to take care of her sister alternately with her mother, but she didn't know if she would come back today. The old woman from the Liu family was very attentive and let him sit in. No one in the Gu family was at home, so they locked all the doors upstairs. Only the empty room downstairs was unlocked, so she brought a chair from her landlord's house, go over and let Zhen sit there. That room was where Yujin had lived before, so the old woman smiled and said, Mr. Zhang, who used to live here, came here again yesterday. Zhen was startled for a moment, and then said with a smile, Oh, this time he come on. Do you still live here? The old woman said, I don't know, I didn't live here yesterday. As she was talking, the Liu family's wife shouted over there, Gao Ma! Gao Ma! She ran away out. This empty room has been closed for a long time, and it is full of dust, making my breathing a bit suffocating. Zhen sat here alone, extremely bored. He stood in front of the window for a while. There was a layer of dust floating on the windowsill, so he casually drew words on the dust, and then erased all the drawings. He was very confused. Just thinking about it, she was thinking about how she should explain to her when she saw Manzin, and also thinking about Yujin's visit yesterday. She didn't know if she saw Manzin. Yujin didn't know if she knew about the termination of his contract with Manzin, whether she should tell him or not. When she was angry and sad, it was a good opportunity for Yujin. Thinking of this, my heart felt even more burning, wishing I could see Manzin right away and put things right. Finally, the doorbell rang at the back door, and when he heard Gao Ma go in to open the door, Zhen hurriedly followed him out and saw that it was Mrs. Gu. Then he went up to greet him and said with a smile, and he is back. He came from Nanjing this time, and this was the first time he met Mrs. Gu. Mrs. Gu saw him, but she didn't say a word of greeting. Zhen found it strange. Her air was so arrogant it seems a bit fussy. He then thought that she must have known that he and Manzin had broken up, so she was angry. When he thought about it this way, he couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed, and he was speechless for a while. Mrs. Gu was originally harboring a hidden agenda, so she was afraid of seeing him. However, when they met, she felt very excited and wanted to tell him right away. She was really anxious and angry, suffering from the fact that there was no one to discuss with. Seeing Zhen was like meeting one of her own, and she almost shed tears. After all, it was inconvenient to speak downstairs, so she said, Go upstairs and sit down. She led the way upstairs. The 2 rooms upstairs were locked. She took the door keys with her, so she reached into her pocket to get them, and touched them. But he touched the large stack of banknotes given by Manlu. Those 80% old banknotes feel soft to the touch, and they are such a thick, square stack. Things like money do have a mysterious power. Mrs. Gu couldn't help but feel that she was sorry for Manlu. It's a good deal with Manlu if she leaks the news quickly and tells Zhen. Young people are motivated by their own emotions, and the government will be alarmed and the trouble will be out of control. Besides, they are uncertain about the affairs of young people. But seeing how he and Manzin can throw away their engagement rings over a trivial matter. If he knew about Manzin's current incident, he would. Can you say you don't care at all? When they arrived, they didn't know if they would still get married or not, so they broke up the Honkai side of things first, but failed on both ends. Thinking about it this way, there seemed to be many reasons. Mrs. Gu took out the key and went to open the door. In such a short period of time, she changed her mind twice and became very confused. She didn't know whether it was because her hands were sweaty or trembling, but she couldn't open the key even though she turned it around. In the end, Shijin opened it for her. When the two walked into the room, Shijin struck up a conversation and asked, "The old lady is out too?" Mrs. Gu responded absently, "Ha." After a pause, she added, "My back hurts. I came back alone first." She went to pour tea for Shijin, and Shijin said hurriedly, "Don't pour it, and let's rest." "Where has Manzin gone? Do you know when she will come back?" Mrs. Gu carried her on her back. He poured tea there, poured 2 cups, and brought 1 cup over. Bang said, "Manzin is sick. He is at her sister's house. I want to rest at her place for a few days." Shijin said, "Sick? What's the matter?" Mrs. Gu said, "It doesn't matter. Ask her to call you in 2 days when she is well. How many more days will you be delayed in Shanghai?" She was eager to find out how many days he would stay in Shanghai, but she didn't answer her question, but said, "I want to go see her." "What's the number on Honkia Road?" Mrs. Gu hesitated for a moment, then said, "What's the number? I don't know. I'm so confused. I only recognize the house, but don't know the house number," he said, and forced a smile. Shijin was very surprised to see that she was clearly hiding something like this. Unless Manzin wanted to do so, her mother was not allowed to tell him her address and was unwilling to meet him. But no matter what, the old man always advocates reconciliation, even if Mrs. Gu is very dissatisfied with him and blames him for his bad things. She will at most be cold to him and will never get involved to prevent them from meeting. He suddenly remembered what Galma said just now, that Yujin came yesterday. Is it still for Yujin? Regardless of the reason, since Mrs. Gu had this attitude, he really had nothing to say to her and could only stand up and say goodbye. As soon as I walked out, I went to a store and borrowed a phone book. I found that there was only one Chu mansion on Hongqiao Road, and of course it was Manzin's sister's house. He found out the house number and immediately hired a car to go there. When he got there, it was just a big house with a tiled wall. Shijin went to ring the bell. A small square hole opened in the iron door, and a male servant showed half his face. Shijin said, "Is this the Shu mansion? I'm here to see the second lady of the Gu family." The man said, "What's your surname?" Shijin said, "My surname is Shen." The man opened the door and then heard the sound of footsteps clattering on the coal road inside, which gradually faded away. He thought he had gone in to report, but when Shijin waited outside for a long time, no one came to open the door. He wanted to press the doorbell again, but held back. This house has no neighbors. It is surrounded by wasteland and vegetable gardens in front and back. It is freezing cold, and there is silence everywhere. The sky was yellow and gloomy in the afternoon, and suddenly a gust of wind blew up, and there seemed to be a woman crying faintly in the air. Wherever the wind passed, it was no longer audible. Shijin thought, where did this sound come from? It couldn't be from the house, right? This place must be very close to Hongqiao Cemetery. Maybe it was the cry on the new grave in the cemetery. When he listened attentively again, there was no sound. I couldn't hear anymore. I just felt miserable in my heart. At this moment, the doorway on the iron door opened again, and the same manservant said to him, "The second young lady of the Gu family is not here." Shijin was stunned for a moment and said, "What? I just came from the Gu family." The wife said that the second lady is here. The manservant said, "I asked, but she is not here." After saying that, he closed the door again with a bang. Shijin thought, she is so heartless and refuses to see me. He stood there in shock for a while, then raised his hand and knocked on the door. The manservant opened the door again, and Shijin said, "Hey, you guys, is your wife at home?" He thought that he had met Manlu once before, and if he could see her, he might be able to ask her to help him. But the manservant replied, "My wife is not feeling well and is lying down." Zhen had nothing to say. The rickshaw that dragged him here came back because the area was deserted and there was not much business. Seeing Zhen still standing there, he asked him if he wanted to drag him back. The manservant watched him get into the car and leave, and then closed the door. Bao had been standing inside the door, but did not show up. Manlu was worried and sent her here, fearing that the manservant might not handle it well. At this time, she quietly asked, "Are you leaving?" The male servant said, "You are gone." "Let's go," Bao said. "Madam asked you all to come in. I will take care of you if I have anything to say." She took several male and female servants, they called them in together. And Manlu said to them, "In the future, if anyone comes to see the second young lady, they will always say that he is not here. The second young lady is recuperating at our place. You should take good care of me. I will never ask you to work in vain. She is so sick. Sometimes I understand, sometimes I'm confused. Anyway, we can't let her go out. Our old lady has entrusted her to me. If she runs away, I have to ask you, but you are not allowed to talk nonsense outside. Do you understand?" Everyone was murmuring. Manlu also gave the annual rewards to them in advance, which was doubled compared with previous years. The servants had all left, and only a Bao was left. Seeing that things were over, a Bao whispered to Manlu, "Miss, please ask Ma Zhang to deliver food to the second miss in the future. Zhang Ma is very strong. When I went in just now, she almost rushed out. I couldn't even hold her back." At this point, she lowered her voice again and said quietly, "But I see her like that. She seems to be sick and can't even stand steady." Manlu frowned and said, "Why are you sick?" Bao said softly, "It must be because of the cold. Smash the window for her and let the wind pour in. It's such a cold day and night. How come I don't get sick from the cold?" Manlu pondered for a while, then said, "We have to move her into a room." "I'll go take a look," Bao said. "Can you go in? You have to be careful." Manlu took a bottle of cold pills and went to see Manzin. The two empty rooms in the back building were locked inside and outside. She opened the outside door first and asked Bao and Zhang Ma to follow them, guard the door to the inner room, then open that door. Through the door, I suddenly heard a squeaking sound inside, and I couldn't help but be surprised. In fact, it was still the same smashed glass window, opening and closing by itself in the cold wind. Every time it slammed, some pieces were broken, glasses fell downstairs one after another, clattering to the ground. Manzin broke the glass window because no one heard her screams at night. She also cut her hand and wrapped it with a handkerchief. She lay motionless on the bed. Manlu pushed the door open and walked in. She fixed her eyes on Manlu. Yesterday her sister was so ill that she almost looked like she was about to die, but today she was up and walking around. So it was obvious that she was pretending to be ill. In this way, her sister was actually an accomplice. When she thought of this, she had cold and heat in her body, but she felt the heat was like a fire. With a bang, it rushed to her head, her face turned red, and her eyesight went black. Manlu also felt guilty. She forced a smile and said, "Why is your face so red? Do you have a fever?" Manzin didn't answer. Manlu walked over step by step. A chair fell on the ground blocking the way. She leaned over and lifted the chair up. The wind blew against the broken glass window. It opened and closed, click and closed, making a loud noise. The sound was not only harsh but also shocking. Manzin suddenly sat up and said, "I want to go back. If you let me go back immediately, I will forget it. Just like being bitten by a mad dog." Manlu said, "Second sister, this is not a matter of anger. I am angry too. Why am I not angry? I made a big fuss with him, but what's the point of making a fuss? What can I really do to him? To say that he is really hateful, but he is sincere to you. I know this. For 2 years, before we got married, he was very envious when he saw you, but he has always respected you. If he hadn't been drunk yesterday, he would never dare to do this again. As long as you are willing to forgive him, he will always do it in the future. I will repay you well, and he will never change his heart for you anyway." Manzin picked up a bowl from the table and threw it on the ground. It was the meal that a beau had just brought in. The soup flowed all over the floor and the bowl was also when it broke. She picked up a sharp piece of porcelain and said, "Go tell Zhu Hongkai to be careful when he comes again. I have a knife here." Manlu was silent for a long time. Then she bent down and wiped the oil splash on her feet with a handkerchief, and finally said, "Don't worry. Let's not talk about this now. You can recover from your illness first." Manzin said, "You are right. Do you want me to go back or not?" After saying that, he held onto the table, stood up and walked out, but Manlu held him back, and in an instant the two of them were twisted into a ball. Manzin was still holding the half of the broken bowl in his hand, which was as sharp as a blade. Manlu was also a little scared and murmured, "What are you doing? Are you crazy?" During the struggle, the broken bowl fell from his hand and fell to pieces. Manzin gasped and said, "You are crazy. What have you done? You colluded with others to harm me. Are you still a human being?" Manlu shouted, "I colluded to harm you. I don't think so. I have been unjustly accused to death, and I don't know how much I have been punished for this matter of yours." Manzin said, "You still want to blame me? You still want to blame me?" She was so hateful that she slapped Manlu's ear with a slap. The blow was so severe that even Manzin himself felt shaken and dizzy. She was stunned, and so was Manlu. Manlu instinctively raised her hand to touch her cheek, but her hand stopped in midair. Half of her face was red, and she just stood there blankly. When Manzin saw it, for some reason, he remembered her past benefits. He had been helped by her in the past many years, but he had never told her words of gratitude. Although there is no talk of giving or repaying kindness in my family, it is also because there is an instinctive shyness among close relatives, and many words seem to be inconvenient to say. In Manlu's case, she just felt that her sister had always looked down on her. After the slap just now, both of them thought of the previous debt at the same time. Manlu thought about it and felt that it was really unfair. She was angry and sad at the same time. She especially found it hateful that Manzin had such a fierce female face. She sneered and said, "Humph, I never expected that such a martyr girl would come out of our family. Huh? If I had been a martyr girl at that time, our whole family would have starved to death. I am a dancer, a prostitute, a woman. No, I am also bullied by others. Where can I go to act like a spoiled brat? I am the same person as you, two sisters. So why should I be so mean and you be so noble?" Her voice got louder and louder as she spoke. Unknowingly, tears flowed down his face. A beau and Zhang Ma were guarding the door. At first they heard the sound of a scuffle in the room. They were startled. They opened the door and were about to come in to persuade them. Then they heard Manlu say something about dancing, prostitutes, and women. Naturally, these words were not something anyone wanted to hear. A beau winked at Zhang Ma and was about to exit, still closing the door. Manzin took this opportunity to rush forward and rushed out sideways. Manlu didn't have time to stop her, so she only held one of her arms, and the two started struggling again. Manzin shouted, "You still won't let me go? Do you know this is illegal? You can still lock me up for the rest of my life. You can kill me." Manlu didn't answer. She just threw her away. After all, Manzin was hot and weak. After being thrown away by Manlu, she took 2 steps back. Then he fell far away and sat on the ground, holding one hand on the fragment of the broken bowl, and couldn't help but let out a cry. Manlu had already run out, crunching on the broken pieces of porcelain, closed the door, clicked the key, and locked it from the outside. Manzin had a big cut on his hand, and blood was flowing down. She picked up her hand and looked at it. When she took a look, she saw the ruby ring on her hand first. Of course, her concept of chastity was somewhat different from that of previous women. She didn't feel that she had anything to be ashamed of, but when she saw the ring on her hand, her heart felt like a needle pricked her heart. Zhen, is he still in Shanghai? Could he come here to find her? I don't know if her mother has been here. It is useless to expect my mother to rescue me. Even if my mother knows the truth, she will never report it to the police. Once a family scandal occurs, the family scandal must not be made public. Moreover, my mother firmly believes in stick to it until the end. She must have thought that the done thing was done, so she had no choice but to follow carelessly. Honkai, the sister, puts a little more pressure on her, and the mother has no idea. The only hope is that the mother is willing to tell Shijin the truth about the matter and discuss it with Shijin. But is Shijin still in Shanghai? She climbed up holding onto the windowsill. The broken glass on the window lattice became zigzag-shaped, like a mountain of sharp knives. Outside the window is a garden. The turf is bare in winter and looks particularly vast. It was surrounded by high walls. She had never noticed that the walls were so high. There is a redbud tree in the garden, its branches like dead vines swaying in the cold wind. She suddenly remembered that when she was a child, she heard people say that there were ghosts under the redbud flowers. I don't know why I say this, but maybe because of this sentence, I always feel that the redbud flower looks eerie. If she died here, there must be her ghost under this redbud flower, right? Anyway, I can't die here in a daze, and I won't accept this tone even if I die. As long as there is a box of matches in the room, she is really good at setting fires, and she might be able to escape during the chaos. Suddenly I heard someone's voice in the room outside. There was a carpenter knocking at work there. They planned to open a small door in the outer door, through which food could be delivered. However, Manzin didn't know what they were doing. He guessed that they might have nailed the door shut and locked her up like a madman. The hammer hammered down with a deafening sound, like nails on a coffin. I heard Abao's voice again, talking to the carpenter there. The carpenter spoke Pudong dialect, and his voice was a little old. For Manzin, it was the sound coming from the vast world outside. Her heart suddenly trembled and she was full of hope. She threw herself on the door and shouted loudly, asking him to deliver a letter to her home and tell him her home address, tell him Shijin's address. She said she was framed and locked up. She also said a lot of things. She didn't know what she said. Even the sharp voice didn't sound like her own. Sound, crying and yelling and banging on the door like this. Don't you just look like a madman? She stopped suddenly. It seemed strangely quiet outside. Of course, Abao has already explained that there is a mad lady imprisoned inside, and she herself is confused that she is on the verge of madness. The carpenter is at work again. Abao stood by and chatted with him. The carpenter's tone was still very peaceful. He said that if they came to call him today, if they came a little late, he would have gone to the countryside and went home to celebrate the new year. Abao asked him how many children he had in his family. Listening to them talking, Manzin felt as if he saw the red lights in other people's windows from a distance on a snowy night, and felt even more miserable. She leaned against the door and sobbed feebly. She suddenly felt that her body couldn't support it anymore, so she had to stumble back to bed. As soon as I lay down, I felt soft and very comfortable, but after a while, I felt that the joints all over my body were sore. It was not suitable to sleep like this, and it was not suitable to sleep that way. I just tossed and turned, and my breathing in my nose felt like fire. She herself knew it was a cold, but she didn't expect it to be so severe. The pores all over my body seemed to be secreting a kind of mucus, which was indescribably uncomfortable. It was getting dark, and the room got darker little by little, but the lights were never turned on. I don't know how much time passed before I fell asleep. However, because the wound on my hand was so painful, I couldn't sleep deeply. I woke up in the middle of the night and suddenly saw a ray of light under the door. I was shocked. At the same time, the key on the door clicked, but after the click, there was silence. She was always on guard, lying down in her clothes without even taking off her shoes, so she lifted the quilt and sat up. However, as soon as she sat up, she felt dizzy and almost fell to the ground. When I looked closely, the ray of light in the crack of the door was gone. After waiting for a long time, there was no sound. I could only hear my heart beating. She thought it must be Zhu Hongkai again. She didn't know where she got the strength. She immediately ran to turn on the light and rushed to stand at the window. She probably had a vague idea in her heart. If there was no other way, she could jump off the building, and she would have to pull him to jump with her. But after a while, there was still no movement at all. The tense nerves gradually relaxed, and then I felt that she was standing in the wind outlet, with the northwest wind blowing in. And the cold wind blew on the feverish body, but there was something strange. The feeling was both chilly and hot, which was very uncomfortable. She walked to the door, turned the door button, and the door opened. Her heart started to beat wildly again. Could someone help her and let her escape privately? The room outside where things were piled was dark. She went to turn on the light, but there was no one there. As soon as she saw a new small door installed on the door, there was a windowsill installed inside the small door, with a lacquer tray on it, holding a pot of tea, a teacup, and a plate of dry snacks. She suddenly realized that instead of letting her escape, she was just opening up the inner and outer rooms. In the future, she could often deliver food through this small door. From this point of view, it turned out to be a long-lasting plan. When she thought about it, she felt as if she had fallen into an ice cellar. I tried the door button, and sure enough it was locked. The little door is also locked. Touching the pot of tea, it was still hot. She poured a cup with trembling hands and drank it. She was very thirsty, but when she took the first sip, she felt that it tasted wrong. In fact, it was because she had no taste in her mouth, but she couldn't help but suspect that the tea might have been drugged. I took another sip and found it was unpalatable. I was a bit suspicious, so I put it down. She really didn't want to go back to the bed in the inner room. So she lay down on the sofa outside and slept all night on the sofa wrapped in old newspapers without turning off the light. The next morning, probably when Bao was delivering food, I saw her moaning and mumbling through the small door. She was not very clear because of the high heat, as if she knew someone had opened the lock. He came in and carried her to the bed inside. After that, people kept bringing her tea and water. I don't know how long it took to be so groggy, but one day I suddenly woke up a lot and saw Bao sitting next to him knitting yarn, humming and singing a tune about the names of flowers in December. She vaguely felt that this was still the past, when Bao was a helper at their house. She thought she must be very sick, otherwise why would Bao not be doing things downstairs, but come upstairs to watch over the patient? Why isn't my mother here? She was also thinking about the office drawer key, which should be sent to Shu Hui. There were many documents locked in the drawer by her, and he couldn't get them. Thinking of this, she couldn't help but become anxious, and murmured, "Where's Jimin? Ask him to send the key to Zhu's house." Bao thought she was talking nonsense at first, and didn't hear clearly. He only heard the two words key. I thought she was talking about the house key, but she was still there, making noises about going out. So she said, "Second miss, don't be anxious. Just take good care of yourself. After you recover from your illness, you can say anything." Manzin felt strange when she saw that her answer was incorrect. The light in this room was very dark, and half of the windows were blocked with a wooden board because the glass was broken. Manzin looked around and gradually remembered that many crazy things that she originally thought were random dreams caused by high fever were actually not dreams. Not dreams. Bao said, "Second miss, don't you want to eat something?" Manzin didn't answer. After a while, Fang shook his head slightly on the pillow. Yin said, "Bao, think about it. I treated you well before." Bao paused for a moment, then smiled and said, "Yes, the second lady treats others the best." Manzin said, "If you are willing to do me a favor now, I will never forget it in the future." Bao whereupon will turned the bamboo needle upside down and scratched his hair, showing that hesitant look, and said with a smile, "Second miss, we eat other people's food. People who eat rice can only do whatever their boss calls them. And the second lady is someone who understands." Manzin said, "I know, and I don't want to ask you for anything else. I just want you to send me a message. Although I don't have the eldest lady, money, I always try to find a way no matter what. I can't let you suffer." Bao smiled and said, "Second miss, that's not the case. You don't know how guarded they are. They will be suspicious if I go out." Manzin saw that she just shied away, only hating that she didn't have more money with her. At this time, no matter how much money she was promised, it was just empty talk. How could she win people's trust? She was so anxious that she unconsciously made fists with both hands, clenching them tightly. Because she was afraid of seeing the ring, she kept wearing it backwards and turned the ruby to the back. As soon as I clenched my fist, I felt that the gem was solidly there. She suddenly felt something in her heart and thought, all women like jewelry. Giving her this ring may be able to touch her heart. If she doesn't like it, it will be used as collateral, and I will use the money to redeem it in the future. She took off the ring. Although she was afraid of seeing it now, she also felt reluctant to part with it. She handed it to Abo and whispered, I also know that you are in trouble. Take this first. Although this is not valuable, it is very precious to me. I will definitely give you money in exchange for it in the future. Bao must have refused to accept it at first. Manzin said, take it. If you don't take it, you just won't help me. Bao half-heartedly accepted it. Manzin said, you can find a way to get me a pen and paper and take them out with you next time you come. She thought she would write a letter and ask Bao to send it to Shu Hui's house. If Zhen had returned to Nanjing, if you go, you can ask Shu Hui to forward it. Bao asked at that time. Second mess. Do you want to write a letter to your family? Manzin shook her head on the pillow, was silent for a while, and then said, write to Mr. Shen. You have seen Mr. Shen. As soon as Zhen was mentioned, tears rolled down his face, and he turned his head away. Bao persuaded her a few more words, just telling her not to be anxious. Then got up and went out, still locking the door from the outside, and then came to Manlu's room. Manlu was on the phone there, and judging from her anxious voice, she must be talking to her mother. She had been calling every day for the past 2 days, urging them to leave quickly. Bao picked up the cigarette butts and newspapers from the ground, and arranged the things on the dressing table. He covered the open cream jars one by one, and picked up all the hair stuck on the brush. Loose. After Manlu finished the call, Bao went to close the door first. Then with a mysterious smile, he took out the ring from his pocket and sent it to Manlu. He said with a smile, the second lady must give this to me just now. I promised to give her money and asked me to deliver a letter to her. Manlu said, oh, to whom? Bao smiled and said, to Mr. Shen. Manlu took the ring in her hand and looked at it. Look. She had heard her mother say that Manzin had such a ruby ring. It was given to her by the man named Shen. It was probably an engagement ring. Yin smiled and said, this thing is not worth a penny. Just give it to me. I won't take it from you for nothing. After saying that, he took the key to open the drawer and took out a bunch of banknotes. Bao looked at it secretly. It was like that there are about 5 or 6 stacks of $10 bills in a stack. In the past, when Manlu was in poverty, she often sold or pawned jewelry, so Bao also had considerable experience in these matters. She also thought that a ring like this wouldn't fetch much, so she might as well give it to someone else. Manlu, it's more reasonable. As expected, she made a small fortune. At that moment, I could not help but pretend to decline. Manlu threw the pile of banknotes on the table with a pop and said, take it. At last you still have a conscience. Bao thanked him, picked it up and put it on his body, and said with a smile, the second young lady is still waiting for me to give her some paper and pen. Manlu thought for a moment, and then said, then don't go in anymore and let Zhang Ma go. As she said that, she remembered something else. Come. So he sent Bao to her parents' house, saying that they didn't have enough manpower, and sent Bao to help them sort out their things. It was called help, which means to urge them, and asked them to leave Shanghai as soon as possible. Mrs. Gu never thought that she would go to Suzhou to celebrate the New Year this year. Firstly, Manlu was pressing hard, and secondly, Mrs. Gu also believed in the saying, we won't move during the first month of the year, so if we wanted to move, we had to move before the New Year. She rushed to collect the bedding sheets that she had washed out a year ago, but she didn't expect that they were all bundled and packed with many large packages. She organized her things so that she couldn't bear to throw them away in this way or in that way. If we take them all, it would be too wasteful to check the luggage on the train. Moreover, there are old rags accumulated over the years, once exposed to the broad daylight. It would be a bit shameful to just transport them out the door and display them in the alley, or pile them on a cart. Seeing that she was in trouble, Bao agreed to transport all these things to the mansion. Fortunately, there were plenty of spare rooms there. In fact, as soon as Mrs. Gu left, Abema called a second-hand collector to come and sell all these things. When Mrs. Gu left, she was very worried and felt like she was being exiled from the army. Thinking about it, what Manlu said may not be reliable, but since all hopes will fall on her in the future, I don't want to think the worst about her. Shijin had a letter for Manzan. Mrs. Gu received it and didn't dare to show it to anyone, so she didn't know what it said. I kept it on my body for quite some time, but on the day I left, I took it out and gave it to a Bao, asking her to take it to Manlu. Shijin's letter was sent from Nanjing. That day he went to Shu's house to look for Manzan, but he didn't see her. He thought she didn't come out to see him on purpose, and felt very sad. When he got home, Mrs. Su told him that his uncle had sent someone to look for him. He thought that he didn't know what had happened, so he hurried to ask, and it turned out that it was nothing. He had a younger uncle who was born to his old concubine. The old concubine had been living in Nanjing, and his younger uncle was studying in Shanghai, and was on winter vacation now. Was going back to celebrate the new year, but his uncle was worried that he would go alone, and wanted Shijin to go back with him. Of course, there is no problem in going back together, but Shijin still has a few days to delay in Shanghai. But his uncle insists on him leaving immediately, saying that his mother also hopes that he will go back early. There is still a lot of work to settle accounts at the end of the year, and he is not there. His father didn't trust others, so he had to take care of it himself. This hard work might be harmful to his health. Shijin listened to his uncle's words, and it seemed that Mrs. Shen had asked him before they left, telling him to urge Shijin to come back as soon as possible. Mrs. Shen must have said more to him than that, and I am afraid that all the worries in her heart had been absorbed. I told him, otherwise he wouldn't be so stubborn, saying that Shijin must leave immediately tomorrow. Seeing him acting like that, Shijin turned pale and felt that it was not worth falling out with his uncle over this matter, so he agreed. He was also in a very disturbed mood. He felt that both he and Manzan needed to calm down and write her a letter after returning to Nanjing. It would be better this way. It would be more sensible to write a letter. He wrote a letter as soon as he returned to Nanjing. He wrote 2 letters in succession, but received no reply. It's Chinese New Year, and this year's Chinese New Year is particularly lively, with people coming and going in the family. His father is tired again after a new year, and his illness suddenly becomes serious. This time, the attack was so violent that the doctor who was treating him also felt that it was difficult. Later, Shijin accompanied his father to Shanghai for medical treatment. When he arrived in Shanghai, his father was admitted to the hospital. The condition was very serious for the first day or 2. Shijin could not leave, so he stayed in the hospital with him day and night. When Shu Hui heard the news, he came to the hospital to visit. Shijin's father was getting better that day. After talking for a while, Shijin asked Shu Hui, "Have you seen Manzan this time?" Shu Hui said, "I haven't seen her for a long time. Didn't she know you were coming?" Shijin said a little embarrassed, "I've been so busy these 2 days that I didn't have time to call her." At this point, Shijin saw that his father seemed to be very kind to them. Pay attention. Just change the subject and go somewhere else. The special caregiver they used was always by their side, Miss Shu, who was very lively and had her little white hat sitting playfully on the back of her head. Within 2 days of their arrival, she was already quite familiar with them. Shijin's father asked him to take out the tea leaves they brought and make Shu Hui a cup of tea. Miss Shu had already noticed that they were tea drinkers, so she smiled and said, "Do you drink Luan tea? There is Miss Yang, is also a nurse here. She now works in a hospital in Luan. She asked someone to bring 10 kilograms of tea and asked me to sell it for her. The price is really cheap." When Shijin heard about Luan, he felt strange. "I feel that it is Manzan's hometown." He smiled and said, "Luan, the hospital you are talking about, is it run by Dr. Zhang?" Miss Shu said with a smile. "Yes. Do you know Dr. Zhang? He is very kind. This time he came to Shanghai. I asked him to bring this tea for the wedding." When Shijin heard this, he was stunned for some reason. He didn't hear what Shu Hui was talking to him. Then he suddenly realized that Shu Hui was asking him, "Which Dr. Zhang is that?" He quickly replied with a smile, "Zhang Yujin. You don't know him." Then he smiled at Miss Shu and said, "Oh, he's married. Do you know the bride's surname?" Miss Shu smiled and said, "I don't know much about it. I just know that the bride's family is in Shanghai, but they went back together after they got married." Zhen just said it again. If he kept asking, he expected that no matter how much he asked, he wouldn't be able to find out the reason. Moreover, in front of his father and Shu Hui, they might be surprised that he was so interested in Dr. Zhang's marriage history. Seeing that he was silent, Miss Zhu thought he had no intention of buying tea, but was too embarrassed to refuse. She thought she was the most knowledgeable person, so she immediately looked at the watch on her wrist and hurriedly went to get the thermometer to try on Jiaotong heat. Zhen only hopes that Shu Hui will leave soon. Fortunately, within a short while, Shu Hui stood up and said goodbye. Zhen said, "I'll go out with you. I'm going to buy something." The two of them walked out of the hospital together. Zhen asked, "Where are you going now?" Shu Hui looked at his watch and said, "I still have to go to the factory. I sneaked out before I got off work today because I was afraid that you would be here after visiting hours. Don't come in." He hurried back to the factory, and Zhen walked into a shop to borrow a phone. He calculated that Manzin should still be in the office at this time, so he dialed the office number. The male employee who was in the same room as her came to answer the phone. Zhen greeted him for a few words before asking him to ask Miss Gu to answer the phone. The man said, "She is not here now. Why, didn't you know?" Zhen was stunned for a moment and said, "She is no longer here. She resigned." The clerk said, "I don't know if there was any replacement later. When the resignation letter came, I knew that she hadn't come for several days. I sent people to her house to find her and said that the whole family had moved away." At this point, because there was silence from Zhen's side, he said again he went down and said, "I don't know where they moved. Don't you know?" Zhen forced a smile and said, "I don't know at all. I just came from Nanjing, and I haven't seen her for a long time." He actually said it again. I exchanged polite words with the man before hanging up the phone. Then he went to the counter and bought another silver coin for making phone calls, and then made a phone call to Manzin's house. Of course, what the man said was definitely not false, but he still couldn't believe it. The bell rang and rang and rang again, apparently in an empty house. Of course they moved away. Zhen was like a man who had just left home less than 2 hours ago when he called back. He said he had already moved away. It makes people feel scared and confused. It was almost like meeting a ghost. He hung up the phone and stood next to the phone for a long time after walking out of the shop and walking blankly on the road, with the faint setting sun shining on the ground. He felt that the world was so big that he had no place to go. "Of course, we should go to the place where she used to live and ask. The people in the alley may know where they moved. There is a 3-tenant family downstairs, and they must have moved out. If there is an address left, from there maybe you can find out something." Manzin's home was far away from here. He took a rickshaw to go there. On the way, he suddenly thought, didn't he ask her to move when they last met? Or did she move away this time because she followed his advice? "I moved, but I didn't write to him for a long time because of my anger." Is it possible? Maybe her letter had already arrived in the 2 days since he left Nanjing. There is another possibility. Maybe she had written the letter a long time ago, but his mother hid it and did not give it to him. But why did she suddenly resign? This completely overturns the above assumption. The rickshaw stopped at the entrance. He didn't know how many times he had been to this place, but this time, he felt a strangeness as soon as he walked into the alley. Maybe it was because he knew that the building was empty, and the houses here immediately seemed narrow, dilapidated and gray. It seems that even the sky above is much lower. He remembered that when he first came, because Manzin's home was always a bit mysterious. He felt a little inexplicable and insecure when he stepped into the alley. Of course, it was not without an element of joy. In that mood, seeing some maids washing rice and washing clothes under public taps also felt like a fresh and bright scene. But now it is cold winter, and there is no one in the alley. There is a small wooden gate at the entrance of the alley. It seems that the alleyman lives there, but there is a maid standing outside his window talking to him. She was wearing cotton-padded jacket and trousers, the waist part of which was extremely bloated, pushing up her belly and sticking out her white apron. She leaned against the window and talked face to face with the people inside. Seeing this situation, Zhen didn't speak to the people watching in the alley. "Let's go in and take a look first." But there was nothing to see, just an empty house with closed doors and windows, and the glass windows were covered with dust like a hazy mist. Zhen stood outside the door for a while, then slowly walked out to the entrance of the alley. This time, the man looking at the alley saw him and came out of the small room to welcome him, nodding and smiling at Zhen. Zhen used to give him money because he often left late at night after talking at Gu's house. The iron door at the entrance to the alley was already closed, so he had to alert the attendants to open the door for him. Now the person looking at the alley nodded to him, and Zhen asked with a smile, "The Gu family moved?" The person looking at the alley smiled and said, "They moved at the end of last year. I have the letters from them here. I forwarded it to them as soon as I knew their address." "Mr. Shen, do you have any place to inquire?" After saying that, he reached out from the window and groped on the table for the 2 letters. The maid he was chatting with just now was standing outside the window, leaning against the window. She quickly turned aside and moved away. Household affairs have always been spread out by servants. The Gu family does not use servants, so even though the alley keepers are well informed, they have a clear account of every family in the alley, and only the Gu family. He was not very familiar with the matter, and because of Manlu's past history, it seemed that their family's affairs were always somewhat mysterious. If they didn't tell them, it would be inconvenient for others to ask. Zhen said, "There is also a Liu family living downstairs. Do you know where they moved?" The person looking at the alley murmured, "The Liu family seems to have moved to Hangzhou. Well, the Gu family is not in Shanghai anymore. I heard the puller saying that they were going to the North Railway Station." Zhen's heart skipped a beat and thought, Beijing Railway Station. Of course Manzhen married Eugen. When I went back, the whole family followed and became close to Eugen. The dream of Manzhen's grandmother and mother finally became a reality. He had known for a long time that Manzhen's grandmother and mother had always meant this, and he felt that this was not the wishful thinking of the 2 old ladies. Eugen had a good impression of Manzhen, but Manzhen didn't say whether he had expressed any further feelings towards her, but Zhen knew intuitively that she had not told him the whole truth. It's not that he is paranoid, it's just that if the people are good enough, you can't help but feel a slight gap between them. She admired Eugen very much, which she did not hide. She almost had a hero worship mentality for him, even though he worked quietly and prepared to end his life as a country doctor. Zhen thought, "Yes, how can I compare with others? My career has just started but it has already been interrupted. She thinks I have surrendered to my family and is very disappointed in me. But because we already have a history of 2 or 3 years, so she is not without attachment to me, but in the past 2 or 3 years, we have never quarreled. But not long after Eugen came here, we had a big quarrel. This must not be an accident. Of course, she was definitely not arguing with me for an excuse. Just because there was an emotional crux there first. It was about to explode. The attendant handed him 2 letters. One was from Manzhen's younger brother's school. It was probably a report card. There was another letter he wrote to Manzhen. He was shocked when he saw his handwriting. In addition to the postmark, there was a circle-shaped soy sauce stain on the envelope. It must have been seen that the alleyman had put a vegetable bowl on it. He took the 2 letters in his hand, looked at them, nodded to the people watching in the alley with a smile, and said, "Okay, I will find a way to forward them to them." He took them and left. When we walked out of the alley, the street lights were already on. He took out the letter he wrote to Manzhen and read it. It's the second letter. She must have received the first one. In fact, the first letter has said everything, and the second letter is simply redundant. He immediately tore it into pieces. The man selling dried mushrooms and tofu shouted from a distance, "The man is here again." At about this time every day, he always came to this area to hawk his food. He walked through the streets and alleys, and there was a lanky old man holding a basket. He must come to the alley where Manzhen lived every day. As soon as Zhen heard that voice, he remembered the countless evenings he spent at Manzhen's house. Beans, dry, 5 spice mushroom beans, dry. The calm and desolate voice gradually came here, making people feel empty. So he thought again that he could go to her sister's house and ask. He had gone back to her sister's house once before and he still remembered the house number. But the place was far away and it might be too late when he got there. He walked a few more steps and hailed a car from a nearby car dealership. When he reached Hongkia Road, it was not yet dark. After getting out of the car and ringing the bell, a square hole was still open in the iron door, and a servant showed half of his face. He seemed to be the same person as last time. Zhen said, "I want to see your wife." "My surname is Shen, and my name is Shen Zhen." The man paused and then said, "I'm afraid my wife has gone out. Let me go take a look." After that, he closed the square hole. Zhen also knew that this was a common tactic used by servants of rich families to deal with visitors. Because he was not sure whether the master would see him or not, he started talking in a casual manner. But he was still anxious, thinking that Manzan's sister might have just gone out. In fact, if her brother-in-law is at home, it will be the same when he sees her brother-in-law. I forgot to ask him just now. Waiting outside the door, he had already expected it, and waited for a long time. Finally, I heard the door latch being unbolted and a side door opened. The servant stepped aside and said, "Please come in." As we walked into the driveway, we were surrounded by thick holly walls on both sides. In the evening, it was already dark in the garden, but it was still very bright in the sky, almost like daytime. Reflecting the pale sky, there is a pale golden crescent moon. Zhen passed by the window, and Manzan heard the footsteps upstairs. The leather shoes were trampled on the crumbled road. There was nothing unusual about this, but there was no one wearing leather shoes up and down here. The servants were all when it comes to cloth shoes. Manlu usually wears embroidered shoes, while Zhu Hongkai wears Zhigong-based shoes with a foundation. There are very few visitors to their home. Who is this? Manzan was lying on the bed, trying to hold up half of her body, and looked out the window very carefully. Although she could not see anything, she could only see the empty sky and a thin streak of pale golden moon in the sky. She thought maybe Zhen was here, but I immediately thought, I am really crazy. I look forward to Zhen coming to save me all day long. When I hear the footsteps, I think it is Zhen. The sound of leather shoes is getting closer and closer, then gradually getting closer and farther away. Manzan felt anxious because she thought, who cares who he is? I'm calling for help anyway. But when she was sick, her throat became hoarse due to fever, and she didn't talk to anyone for several days. I have already spoken, so I don't feel much about it yet. When he opened his mouth at this time, he was surprised. He shouted with a hoarse voice, and all he heard was a rustling sound in his throat. The room was dark, and she was the only one there. A Bao had not come in since Bai took a ring from her last time, and Zhang Ma had been taking care of her. Zhang Ma happened to walk away for a while and went to the kitchen to eat rice cakes. This is still the first month of the year, and there are a lot of rice cakes left at home, so the servants can make them and eat them at any time. Zhang Ma cooked a large bowl of rice cake soup and took a sip. Suddenly she saw a Bao sneaking in and shouted in a low voice, "Grandma Zhang, come up quickly. I'm calling you." Zhang Ma quickly put down the bowl. Asked, "Madam, you called me?" A Bao nodded slightly and said, "I asked you to go to the back room and watch. Pay attention." When Zhang Ma heard this, she thought it was something happening again at Manzan's place. Unexpectedly, he ran upstairs in a panic. A Bao followed, and then he reached the foot of the stairs when he met the manservant leading Zhen in from the door. Zhen had seen a Bao at Manzan's house before. Although he only met her once, he remembered her very well because he glanced at her. A Bao felt guilty for a moment, fearing that if he started talking to her and asked where the Gu family had moved now, he might end up saying something wrong. She just lowered her head, pretended not to recognize him, and went upstairs. The manservant led Zhen into the living room and turned on the light. The living room is very large and beautifully decorated, but not many people seem to come here, and every conversation is echoed. The hot water was burning vigorously. As soon as Zhen sat down, he took out his handkerchief to wipe his sweat. The footman went out for a while. then brought tea in and placed it on a low table in front of him. Seeing 2 cups of tea, Shijin raised his eyes and saw that Manlu had already come in, walking from the other end of the room. She was wearing a long black cheongsam, and the rhinestone trimmed skirt was exposed from the crotch of the robe. Wearing black silk trousers, he walked over quietly on the big lotus gray velvet carpet. Shijin felt that the last time he saw her, she didn't seem so thin. Her eye sockets were sunken deeply. Looking in the shadow of the lamp, her eyes were almost like 2 holes. The makeup on her face was red and white, but for some reason, it reminded Shijin of the 4 words red skull. Literally speaking, it should be a bit like her face shape. He had never dealt with a woman like her before, and he was a little flustered. So he stood up, nodded deeply to her, and before she came up to him, he hurriedly stated his intention and said, "I'm sorry to disturb Mrs. Chu. I went to see Manzin just now, and their whole family has moved away. I don't know where they have moved now." Manlu just smiled and said yeah, and said, "Mr. Shen, sit down, have some tea." She sat down first. Shijin had already noticed that she was holding a small paper bag in her hand. He couldn't help but glance at the paper bag twice, but he couldn't guess what it was, and it didn't look like a letter. He sat down opposite her, and Manlu opened the paper package. There was another layer of silver paper inside. She opened the silver paper package again and took out a ruby ring. When Shijin saw the ring, he couldn't help but trembled in his heart and couldn't tell what he felt. Manlu handed the ring over and said with a smile, "Manzin expected it. She said that Mr. Shen might come to see me. She asked me to give this to you." Shijin thought, "This is what she gave me," replied to her letter. He took it mechanically, but at the same time he was thinking, "Didn't this ring have been returned to me a long time ago? When I returned it to me, I threw the wastebasket away in front of her. Why did it fall down now? You want to give it back to me again? This is not a valuable thing. If you have to give it back to me, you can just send it to me. There is no need to do it so solemnly. You want her sister to hand it over to you. Isn't she trying to anger me? He's not such a person. I don't believe it. If a person changes his heart, his whole person will change." He was silent for a while and then said, "So she is not in Shanghai now. I still want to talk to her in person." Manlu looked at him and smiled, and then said slowly, "Then I don't need to see it, right?" Shijin paused, then blushed and asked, "Is she married?" Manlu's face moved, but she didn't answer immediately. Shijin smiled again and said, "Are you married to Zhang Yujin?" Manlu picked up the teacup and took a sip. She originally had an adaptable attitude. Although she knew that Shijin was very suspicious of Yujin, she did not dare to insist that Manzin was married to Yujin, because such lies were easy to detect. But it seemed in this situation, if he didn't say this, I guess he wouldn't give up. She held the teacup, stared at him over the rim, and said with a smile, "Since you know, there is no need for me to elaborate." In fact, Shijin didn't have much hope when he came to her, but after saying this, I still felt like there was a loud bang, and everyone was stunned, unable to say a word. After a while, he stood up hastily, nodded to her, smiled and said, "I'm sorry to bother you for so long." Then he turned and left. But as soon as he took a step, there was a creaking sound under his feet, and he stepped on something. When he lowered his head, he saw that it was his ring. I held it well in my hand, but for some reason my hand loosened and it rolled to the ground. I don't know when it fell to the ground. The carpet was so thick that no sound could be heard. He bent down to pick it up and quickly put it in his pocket. It would be a joke if he still left the ring at someone else's house after making a fuss for a long time. Manlu also stood up at this time, and Shijin didn't look at her. No matter her expression was mocking or sympathetic, it was still unbearable. He hurriedly walked out the door. The servant had already opened the door and was waiting there. Manlu walked back to the gate and went back, and the manservant still sent him out. Shijin walked very fast, and the manservant followed closely behind. After a while, he was out of the garden gate and walking on the road. A car came whining over there, with white lights on both sides leading the way. There is no sidewalk on Hongqiao Road. just an asphalt avenue, but there is a sand-paved road next to it, specially for horse racing on it. Zhen avoided walking on the horse-riding path, his feet stepping on the loose dust, soft and soft, making no sound at all. The street lights were dimly lit, and people felt a little drowsy. The ring was still in his pocket. If he took it home and took a closer look, he could see blood stained on the velvet wrapped around the ring. The wool was brown, and the dried blood was reddish-brown. You couldn't see it when stained on it, but the blood glue stuck to the wool, and the wool was completely stiff. You can see it if you look closely. He must have felt strange when he saw it, so he became suspicious. But that seems like something out of a detective novel, and probably won't happen in real life. As Zhen walked, he kept feeling that the ring was in his trouser pocket, and that Ruby was like a burning cigarette butt, burning his legs. He reached in, took out the ring, and threw it into the field beside the road without even looking at it. That night when he returned to the hospital, his father asked him where he had been because he had been out for the day. He only said that he had met acquaintances and was dragged by them, so he came back at this time. His father saw that he was in a daze and guessed that he must have gone to find his girlfriend. The next day, his uncle came to the hospital to visit him. He sat there for a long time. Zhao Tong talked too much, and his condition worsened again that night. From that day on, it became heavier day by day. I stayed in the hospital for 2 months. Later, Mrs. Shen also came to Shanghai, and my concubine and her children also came, waiting to die. Zhao Tong died in the hospital that spring. In spring, the redbud tree at Zhu's house on Hongqiao Road also bloomed, and a tree of small red flowers bloomed in lush purple colors. There was a bird standing on the windowsill of Manzanan jumping up and down. The room was strangely quiet. It thought there was no one in the room, so it flew in and fluttered around. Manzan didn't seem to care about it. Notice, she is sitting on a chair. She had recovered from her illness, but she discovered she was pregnant. She is always so blank now, and her whole person is a little numb. Sitting there, the sun was shining on her feet, which was very warm, like a yellow cat purring on her feet. Because she was completely isolated from the world, even the sunlight shining on her body felt strangely friendly. She never cries now, except sometimes when she thinks about how she will meet Zhen one day in the future and how she will tell him her experiences one by one. When she thinks about it, she feels as if she is already facing him face to face. As she spoke, she immediately burst into tears.
Alright, this part of the story ends here.
Want to know what happened next? Let's listen to the breakdown next time.